Well, isn't this a wonderful? I love this time of the year, Thanksgiving, and we have sometimes friends that come and visit from out of town, and we just have a good time seeing sometimes family members that we haven't seen for a while. It's a fun time of the year. Oh, hey, by the way, did you notice our candle is lit over here? Did you see that? See that candle up there right in front of the drums over there? What do we call that? That's our new birth candle. And we light that. See, it's right over here. I'm going to walk right over here. Okay? Here it is, right here. New birth candle, right there. It has the flame that we can light anytime we want because it's battery operated. And I used to use a real candle with a real flame, but you know what happened? The candles would burn down. We kept running out of candles. We had so many things that God was doing and things were happening. We had to just keep, I said, let's just get a battery operated one, and we'll light that whenever we want it. It makes it real easy. But I want to show you someone's picture. We've got a picture of Mary, and we prayed this morning for Pastor Shu Ming and his wife Christina, and this is Mary Jin. And Mary is another one of our church planters who is working on planting another Chinese church, Mandarin speaking, right here at Celebration on Sunday afternoons. Eventually they will move to Irvine, but they are reaching, again, more Chinese people living in the city of Irvine. And I wanted to put her picture up there. We wanted to light the candle because she just shared with us the other day that as she has been building this team and as she's been talking with Chinese people about Jesus, she had, in the month of October, get this, in the month of October, she was able to introduce 8 Chinese people to Jesus. Isn't that awesome? Isn't that awesome? So what do? We celebrate that at Celebration. And we're thankful for what God is doing through people like Mary here at Celebration and in Orange County. Well, this morning we want to continue our series. We're in a series on the life of David. And if you have a Bible, you've got your phone with you. If you would like to turn with me this morning to 1 Samuel chapter 23, we're going to look at some things there today. But as you're turning there, occasionally we read in the newspaper or we see on something online or maybe on TV, there's a story that captures our attention. And I came across one of those not long ago about a man who had a very unusual experience. I want to put his picture up on the screen so you can see what he looks like, and I want to tell you his story. His name is Joseph Sardler. And one night he was home when he happened to stumble over his dog's dinner dish on the floor and went tumbling down the basement stairs. You say, well, what a terrible thing to have happen. Yes, indeed. But what you need to know about this gentleman is the reason why he stumbled over the dog's dinner dish and went tumbling down the stairs is because he was blind. And he went tumbling down the stairs, and his head cracked into the wall. And when that happened, his sight amazingly returned. And he looked up, and he saw something kind of right in front of him there, and it began to crystallize, and suddenly it was the heater down in the basement. He could see. And I got to tell you what he said after going through this experience. He said, it's a miracle. It's nothing else but a miracle. That's all I can say. I thank God because it was him that did it, that gave me my sight back. Well, this was early in the evening. He couldn't go to bed that night. He was able to look and see things that he had not been able to see for 6 years. 6 years earlier, he had lost his sight. And it wasn't until he crashed into that wall that suddenly a miracle occurred. God provided, and he could see again for the first time in 6 years. But here's the amazing thing. You know what he enjoyed seeing most of all after that fall down the stairs and his sight was returned? his little daughter, he saw her for the first time. She was 5 years old, and he got to see her for the first time. Now you might wonder, what does a story like that, what could that possibly have to do with the life of David? Well, it illustrates something for us this morning about the timing and the sovereignty of God that David experienced 3,000 years ago, and we're going to look at today in this chapter in 1 Samuel chapter 23. Now, David's been on the run, as you know, for his life from evil King Saul for some time now. And this chapter 23 has some of the most interesting events, all contained in one chapter of any place in the Old Testament. Saul has been pursuing David, and in this story, we're going to discover this morning 4 ways God provides for David and for us when we go through times of trial and testing and difficulty in our own lives. We're going to see in 1 Samuel chapter 23, David experiences the God who provides. What does God do? How does God provide when we are going through stressing, hard, difficult times? What does God do? Well, we're going to take a look at these events, and they are absolutely amazing in the life of David. Now, the first experience where we're going to start today with the God who provides occurs during an encounter David had with his arch enemy, the Philistines. Now, remember who the most famous Philistine was of all? What was his name? Goliath. Goliath was from the Philistines. And David defeated Goliath, and a whole bunch of things happened after that. But David is going to have another encounter with the Philistines again. And notice how this story begins to unfold here in chapter 23, beginning in verse 1. It says, Then they told David, saying, Behold, the Philistines are fighting against Keilah, and are plundering the threshing floors. So David inquired of the Lord, Shall I go and attack these Philistines? And the Lord said to David, Yes, go and attack the Philistines and deliver Keilah. Now, we don't know a whole bunch about this town, but we do know this much, that Keilah was a town that was being raided by the Philistines during the harvest time. And they're making off with the grain after it's been grown and it's been threshed and it's all ready then for the people to enjoy. Suddenly these raiders from the Philistines come in, sweep in, and they take all of the grain that has been harvested and prepared by the people. That is not only frustrating, but it's also life-threatening to these people. And when David learns of the problem, he says, we've got to do something about this. But notice what he does first. Before taking any action, he says, God, is this something that I should do? He asks for divine direction. And David receives assurance. The Lord says, yes, by all means, go and attack the Philistines, deliver the city of Keilah. But his men were not exactly sure about this idea. They were a little apprehensive. Look with me at verses 3 and 4. But David's men said to him, Behold, we are afraid here in Judah. How much more than if we go to Keilah against the ranks of the Philistines? Then David inquired of the Lord, watch this, once more. And the Lord answered him and said, Arise, go down to Keilah, for I will give the Philistines into your hands. Now David's men were afraid. They were apprehensive because they were concerned about going into a walled city where they themselves could end up being easily trapped, surrounded, and cut off with no possible way of retreat. Now you have to remember that these men who are with David are not exactly military men. In fact, they were a rather motley crew at best. In those days, I would imagine they would have had a military classification of 3D. You say, what's that? Well, in 1 Samuel 22, verse 1, it tells us these men were characterized by the 3 Ds. They were known for their distress, their debt, and their discontent. Not exactly the kind of men you'd pull together for a fighting force, in other words. But that's who David had with him. And instead of being pulled down and pulled away from the task by his men's pessimism, what does he do? He looks to the Lord for guidance and reassurance in verse 4. Lord, my men are apprehensive. Should we go in and attack the Philistines? And the Lord says a second time, by all means, yes, I will deliver them into your hands. Now again, his men weren't exactly a military fighting machine. They were kind of more like the dirty dozen, if you will. That's who David was working with. But when he receives the green light, the Bible tells us David sweeps in, slaughters the Philistines, delivers the city, and everybody is so happy that all this has happened. Well, so far so good. But as we know, it's one thing to get into a city. It's another thing to try to get out. So notice what happens to David as this story develops in verse 6. Now it came about, when Abiathar the son of Ahimelech fled to David at Keilah, that he came down with an ephod in his hand. When it was told Saul that David had come to Keilah, Saul said, God has delivered him into my hand, for he shut himself in by entering a city with double gates and bars. So Saul summoned all the people for war to go down to Keilah to besiege David and his men. Kind of sounds like exactly what his men were afraid of. It was starting to happen. Saul's reconnaissance tells him exactly where David is. He marshals together his army. They surround the city, and David and his men are indeed trapped in Keilah. You say, well, what does David do? Well, it's interesting as you look at this story, there are 2 different sides presented here. On one side, as we're going to see, Saul literally believes that God is putting David right in his hands. He believes that God's doing this for him. He says, God, look at verse 7. He says, God has delivered him into my hand. Saul says, I've got David right where I want him. He's trapped with no way out. Now, I think there's an important lesson to be made here for us about how we sometimes interpret our circumstances. You know, I talk to people from time to time, and sometimes someone will make a comment to me. Well, God led me to do this, or God led me to do that. And that sometimes can be the case. But when I ask them, how do you know that God led you to do such and such? They will often respond by telling me that they looked at what was happening in their life and they interpreted what was happening as God's leading. So let me offer just a word of caution this morning. And this is what that word of caution is. Notice on your outline this morning, we've got this in your notes for you. I believe we need to be careful how we sometimes read our circumstances. We need to be careful how we interpret what goes on in our lives. Now, why do I say that? Because circumstances may not always be what they think they are. Have you ever heard that saying, appearances can be what? Deceiving. They may look to be a certain way, but on further reflection, we find out maybe that's not exactly what I thought it was going to be. Take the case of the woman who bought a small package of cookies one day between flights in an airport. She sat down in the busy snack shop to glance over the newspaper for a few minutes. As she read her paper, she became aware of a rustling noise. Peeking above the newspaper, she was shocked to see a well-dressed gentleman sitting across from her, helping himself to her cookies. Half angry, half embarrassed, she reached over and gently slid the package closer to her as she took one out and began to munch on it. A minute or so passed before she heard more rustling again. The man had gotten another cookie. By now, there was only one left in the package. Though flabbergasted, she didn't want to make a scene, so she said nothing. Finally, as if to add insult to injury, the man broke the remaining cookie in two pieces, pushed one piece across the table toward her with a frown, and gulped down his half without even saying thank you. She sat there literally dumbfounded. Sometime later, when her flight was announced, the woman opened her handbag to get her ticket. And to her shock, there in her purse was her package of unopened cookies. And somewhere in that same airport was another traveler still trying to figure out how that strange woman could have been so forward and insensitive as she was. Assumptions can be deceiving, can't they? Well, God does at times, we know, reveal His will through circumstances. We're not saying He doesn't do that. But we do need to be careful sometimes. Because so often we may be praying about something, we may be wanting something so badly that it's so easy for us, isn't it, to sort of put little things together and think, well, this must be what God is doing. This may be what God is orchestrating. And sometimes it is. But sometimes it is not. In fact, if you look again at verse 7, Saul is so convinced, isn't he, that what is happening, God is doing for him. And if you look inside the city of Keilah, and there is David, and he's certainly convinced that this is not what God must be allowing for his benefit, to be surrounded by Saul and his troops on the outside. Well, what does David do? Well, let's look at verse 9. Now David knew that Saul was plotting evil against him, so he said to Abiathar the priest, "Bring the ephod here." Then David said, "O Lord God of Israel, your servant has heard for certain that Saul is seeking to come to Keilah to destroy the city on my account. Will the men of Keilah surrender me into his hand? Will Saul come down just as your servant has heard? O Lord God of Israel, I pray, tell your servant." And the Lord said, "He will come down." Verse 12. Then David said, "And will the men of Keilah surrender me and my men into the hand of Saul?" And the Lord said, "They will surrender you." Now, because Abiathar the priest was with him, and he had the ephod, which was often used in those times by the Israelites to help determine God's will, David prays, he says again, "Lord, is this what you want? Do you want us to stay here? What should we do? Do we need to leave? Do we need to be on the move?" And God reveals to him exactly what this people of Keilah are going to do. They're going to turn him over to Saul. Now, how's that for gratitude, huh? After he just has come in to rescue them and to save them from the Philistines, now they're going to turn him over to his worst enemy. Thanks a lot, guys. Let me ask you this morning, do you ever find yourself angry or maybe just a little hurt when people fail to appreciate your help? How about when your help is taken for granted and no one even bothers to say thank you? Well, David is to be commended here Because when he learns what they're about to do, he doesn't retaliate. He doesn't try to get even. In fact, he and his men leave the city quietly. But may I offer a second word of caution today? And it's in your notes if you'll notice this. We need to be aware of the bitterness that can sometimes creep in when our own efforts go unappreciated on behalf of others. When our efforts at being generous, at being kind, sometimes go unacknowledged, you know something? We can become a little bitter. We can become a little resentful. And we think to ourselves, well, that's the last time I'm going to do something nice for them, when they don't even acknowledge what I've done. You know, sometimes that can happen with our kids, can it? How about with your grandkids, and you send them a birthday card and a little gift inside, and you never hear a word back if they even got it. And you kind of wonder, I'm not sure I want to keep doing that. No one even acknowledges what I've done. Well, I've certainly felt that way before, and yet, you know what's helped me? I've always been encouraged to remember the words of Jesus, something he said about what we give. I want to put this up on the screen. This is from Luke chapter 6, verses 35 and 36. Jesus had something to say about this, and notice his words. He says, "But love your enemies and do good." To who? Enemies. Not just loved ones here, not just friends, even enemies. Watch this. And expect what? Nothing in return. I don't know about you, but that doesn't always sit so well with me, huh? How about you? Expecting nothing in return. Not even a thanks. And your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High, for he himself, watch this, he's our model, he himself is kind, what? To even evil and ungrateful men. Be merciful. Just as your Father is merciful. Even though we may not hear anything in response, there may be no appreciation offered, he says, be merciful. Continue to bless, even when you don't hear anything in response. That's the Jesus way. Wow. Did you notice something in this story as we've looked at so far? We've seen 4 times now that David did not know exactly what to do or what was going to happen, but what did he do? 4 times he sought the Lord for a specific answer. 4 times David prayed and God gave him an answer. When God told him it was time to attack, he attacked. When God said it's time to run, he ran. Do you realize that the very same direct access that David had to God 3,000 years ago, we have today? We've got that same kind of line, direct line, to a God who is interested, who listens, and who cares. I love what the book of Hebrews writes about Jesus, remember, our high priest. I'm going to put this up on the screen again for you. Hebrews chapter 4, verses 15 and 16. Remember who Jesus is. Remember what he offers us. For we do not have a high priest who is off and aloof and away. No, one who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses. That's not who Jesus is. But rather one who has been tempted in all things as we have, and yet is without sin. Here's the conclusion that he draws, therefore. Therefore, let us draw near with confidence to the throne of what? What is God's throne known as? A throne of what? Grace. That we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. He's saying this Jesus who is in heaven is the very one whose ears are open to our prayers, to our concerns, to our trials, to our hardships. He's open, he's listening, because it's the throne of grace. Notice it's not the throne where I have to deserve something. It's not the throne I go to and I wonder if he's listening, or I hope he will. It's the throne of grace. He hears everyone. I'm reminded of another passage I'd like to put up on the screen that's been so helpful to me over the years. When I haven't known exactly what to do. It's Jeremiah 33:3. And I love how God just throws this out here to his people. He says what? Read it together with me. Let's read it together. Call to me, and I will answer you, and I will tell you great and mighty things which you do not know. Now look how personal this is. How many times is the word you used there? Call to me and I will answer you, Kurt. And I will tell you, Terry, great and mighty things which you, Kathy, do not know. I love that. That's God speaking to us. That's God speaking to me. You got a few things in your life you don't know about? A few things you don't know what to do? A few things that you need God's help with? Who are you going to call? Not Ghostbusters, God, right? You're going to call God. Call to me and I will answer you. Oh, I love that. And then I'm reminded of what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 7. Remember, Jesus said, ask and you what? Receive. Seek and you will. Knock and it will be opened. And then Jesus said, for everyone who asks and seeks and knocks, and that's in the present tense in Greek. So it's the idea of he who keeps on asking, he who keeps on seeking, he who keeps on knocking will receive. What does that tell me? Well, don't just ask once, but if it's something that's really important to you, it's okay to keep bringing it to God. You know, you can't wear God down. God's not worn down with our prayer. You can't ask him too often or too much. Call to me, I will answer you. Keep asking, keep seeking, keep knocking. Why? Because God is at work. And then I love this passage. Let's put one more up there, can't we? Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 and 6. Oh, this is such a good one. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him. In other words, look to him, ask him, talk to him, and he will make your paths straight. Now, I don't know about you, but you know how life sometimes looks to me? It looks like a squiggly line that's going all over the place. And I'm wondering, what in the world am I supposed to make out of all this? And what does God say? Kristen, what does it say? When we acknowledge, when we focus, when we give this to God, what does he do with all that squiggly line stuff that's going over? He says, I will make your paths straight. I don't like squiggly mountainous roads when I'm driving, do you? But I sure like it when it's a straight highway. God says, look, you look to me, and I'm going to take all those twists and turns, and I'm going to give some direction. I'm going to give some clarity to what you may not see or understand going on in your life. Isn't that good? That's what God is asking us to do. That's what David is demonstrating to us. David didn't know what to do. He didn't know if he was supposed to stay, fight, run. He didn't know. But he asked God. And God, 4 specific times, told him exactly what he was supposed to do. Do you know something? We have a God who's willing to provide guidance to us in our lives. We're not on our own. It's not all up to us. In fact, this guidance is not only available, do you know it's promised? Can I put one more passage up on the screen? James chapter 1, verse 5. Remember what James says? But if any of you lacks wisdom. Can I just ask, do you ever feel like you lack wisdom sometimes in your life? You don't know what to do? If any of you lacks wisdom, what do? Let him ask of God. Who what? Who gives to all generously and without reproach, and it will be given to him. Boy, God is the one we need to go to when we don't know what to do. Now, that's the first way in which God provides guidance to David in his life. And I want to share with you a second one today. We're not going to get through all 4 of these. I think we'll have to finish this up a little bit next week. But I want to show you the next time that God shows up and David experiences the God who provides. Again, he's in the desert. He's out in the wilderness. And notice where we pick up the story here in verse 14. It says, David stayed in the wilderness, in the strongholds, and remained in the hill country in the wilderness of Ziph. And Saul sought him every day, but God did not deliver him into his hand. So what's going on here? In verse 14, in just one verse, literally what's happening, God is packing in several months of close calls and narrow escapes by David from Saul's desperate pursuit. Now, David is hiding in a virtual desert. It's hot, it's parched, it's a barren piece of real estate, it's a wasteland. Think, if you will, of being in the most remote, desolate place you can imagine. That's what this area of land is like. And it says in verse 14, every single day Saul pursued David. In other words, he was relentless. He never gave up. Now, you would have thought that Saul would have been happy, at least that that David wasn't in Jerusalem. He was out in the wilderness. And yet, he was obsessed with tracking down David and killing him. And it all comes down to one three-letter word that we just read, but most of us didn't even notice it was there in verse 14. Every day, Saul sought David. And then we come to this small three-letter word in verse 14. But God did not deliver him into his hand. Do you realize that in every trial, every difficulty, every challenge that we face, there are 2 sides? On one is the side we can see, what we experience on this side on planet Earth. For David, it was the hooves of the horses that Saul's men were riding on as they pursued David through the desert. That's one thing. That's the side that we see. But did you realize there's another side to the problems and challenges and difficulties that we face? And that's the invisible side that we can't see, that is the superintending providential hand of God working behind the scenes where we cannot see. And we do not know what is going on. As often as Saul sought David, God protected him. I want you to notice here how we see the provision of God's divine protection in David's life. And that leads us to this verse that I want to finish up with this morning. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 13. What does God promise to do for us in our life? I know this is kind of a long verse, but let's see if we can just unpack this a little bit here today. It says, no temptation has overtaken you but such as is common to man. And God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will provide the way of escape also, so that you may be able to endure it. Now let me just make a couple of comments here about this verse, and I'll give you something to write down, okay? It says, no temptation. Now, in the Greek word for temptation can be translated with either of 2 words, temptation, the word temptation, or the word trial. Just depends on the context. But either word can be used there. So what God tells us is there is no temptation, and we can also say there is no trial, no difficulty that has ever come upon you, but is such to what others will experience in this life, okay? That we know. But what else do we know? Not only is this something others have experienced probably before in their life, but we also know that God is faithful, and what does he say he will do? Who will not allow you to be tempted or tried or tested beyond what you are able. Now think about that. Do you realize there's nothing that comes into your life that's greater than you can handle with his help? And notice what he promises. Whatever is allowed to come into your life, whether it be a temptation, a trial, a difficulty, a hardship, he says he will also provide the way of escape, a way to deal with it, a way to handle it, so again, that we may be able to endure it with his help. Now, can I just boil all of what I just said down into one statement? And here it is on your outline. Every trial, every temptation in your life is Father filtered. Father filtered. In other words, divinely screened, divinely determined. So God looks at my life, he looks at your life, he knows how much we can handle with his help. And that's why we don't all experience the same stuff. It's different for every one of us because we all deal with stuff differently, and God knows what we can handle, and God will never allow us to go through something that's greater than what we can handle with his help. God protects and limits certain events from ever touching our lives. Nothing occurs in life that God has not first divinely permitted, allowed to occur. And why can we say that? Because behind the scenes, like we said, that invisible side that we don't see, that we're not aware of, God sovereignly controls the events of our lives constantly, limiting, directing them both for our good and his glory. I want to close with this story. This is, to me, one of the greatest stories illustrating the sovereign hidden side of those trials and hardships and difficulties that we don't see, that remind us of how God works. This is a story from the life of George Washington. It's when he was serving on the American side along with the British against the French and the Indians. And it's an event that occurred in 1755 as George Washington, along with the British, were on their way to recapture Fort Duquesne from the French and the Indians, which is now present-day Pittsburgh. Get an idea where we are. They are marching on the way to deliver and to overtake this fortress. When they are suddenly ambushed just 7 miles from the fort, when they are suddenly ambushed by French and Indians on both sides. They can't see them. They're in the woods. At the end of 2 hours of fighting, 714 of the 1,300 British and American troops had been shot down. Only 30 of the French and Indians had been shot. Again, hiding in the woods. This event, if you want a name for it, there is a name for it. It's called Braddock's Defeat, because the British general his name was Braddock, and they were wiped out. But this gets more interesting. There were 86 British, American officers involved in that battle. 86 officers. At the end of the battle, get this, George Washington was the only officer who had not been shot down off his horse. He was the only officer left on horseback of 86. The next day, Washington wrote a letter to his family explaining that after the battle was over, he had taken off his blue jacket and had found 4 bullet holes through it, and yet not a single bullet had touched him. Several horses had been shot out from underneath him, but he had not been harmed. And he told them, as he wrote to his family and friends, quote, by all the powerful dispensations of providence, I have been protected beyond all human probability or expectation. End of quote. But the story doesn't end there. 15 years later, Washington is back in that same area around Fort Duquesne when he happens to meet up with a warrior chief who 15 years earlier had been involved in that battle, and tells him what had gone on from the French and Indian side that George Washington would never have known. Why were all these officers shot down? Because this chief had told his braves to target the officers on horseback. This particular chief, as he was telling Washington the story, said that he had personally fired at Washington 17 times without ever hitting him. When they finally met, this former Indian chief said to Washington, quote, "I have traveled a long and weary path, that I might see the young warrior of that great battle. I am come to pay homage to the man who is the particular favorite of heaven and who can never die in battle." Wow. Now, you won't find that in the history books today, friends. Why would God put a protective bubble around a man named George Washington? Because of what he would use him to do in the coming years. You see, there's a side to all of this that we don't experience, we don't see in this life. That hidden side. We see the problem, we see the challenge, we see the hardship, we see the difficulty, but behind that is that invisible side where God is working. And God continues to work. Well, David's story is really only just beginning here in chapter 23. And Saul is hot on his trail, and he's not finished yet. And next week we'll find out what happens. Can you join me? Let's close in prayer, huh? Well, Father, we thank you. It's so amazing as we look at these stories in Scripture of how time and time again they do illustrate for us how your sovereign, providential hand is working in the life and the affairs of our lives. We've seen some tremendous examples today of the God who provides direction when we don't know what to do, the God who answers prayer, but also the God who is sovereignly working behind the scenes to protect, to direct, to arrange the fulfillment of your will. And Lord, I know that as we close in prayer today, there's certainly some among us here who have some needs, who are facing some challenges. And we want to pray specifically, Lord, for those who find themselves in just such a place today. Lord, would you divinely meet them right where they are? Will you answer their needs? Will you provide, Lord, the way that you know only you can do? We thank you for your faithfulness, and especially during this Thanksgiving season, how good it is to give thanks to the God who provides. We give you our love and our praise today in Jesus' name. And all God's people said, Amen. I want to remind you our Coffee and Connection will be going on over in the cafe. I hope you can come over and join us today. And God bless. We'll see some of you tonight.